All right, hello everybody, welcome. Thank you guys for coming.
Hey, before she starts talking, let me just say welcome, and also thank you for getting here early, and thank you for actually eating before you said a blessing, because that is like not Baptist at all. So anyway, I'm going to bless the food that you've already eaten, unless you didn't do so already. But thank you, and let me just say again, thanks to Brady and Paige, and what you're going to experience over the next couple of hours and a half. Let me just tell you, it is this presentation is very God honoring. It is thorough. It is well researched. It is heartfelt, and for many of us, it'll be very, very different. It'll be unlike anything we've ever heard. So, kind of buckle up your seatbelt. Even if you don't remember everything, you're going to take a lot of notes, and there's a lot of notes already in front of you. You know, folks, even if you just can remember one or two or three things, if your mind may not be able to be able to adequately experience all of this and remember it, but just a couple of nuggets, man, it's going to be worth your time. It's going to be worth your investment. So let me pray, and then we'll turn that over to Brady and Paige. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for your presence here. Thank you for the food that we're enjoying already. And God, we thank you for your truth. God, and thank you that our faith is not a pretty sure faith or a hope so faith, but it's a surety. God, even today I was encountering someone at lunch who was struggling with his doubt. And Lord, I just thank you that we could point to the certainty of your word, your Holy Spirit, and thank you that science and reason and logic supports that. So Lord, I thank you for that. And I pray that you would just help arm us, equipment. We're not here tonight to get smarter or to learn some more facts. We're here to be equipped, but equipped so that we could advance the gospel. So I pray that our ultimate goal tonight is not to get smarter or learn more, but to help advance the gospel, because we love you so much and we want others to know the joy of their salvation as well. So we thank you for your love. Thank you for Brady and Paige, and we lift this time up to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hello, thank you for coming. As Pastor Mac alluded, you guys have some materials on your tables. So if you don't have that already, go ahead and grab one. Feel free to take notes. These are the slides from today, but we're going to have a lot of extraneous notes that aren't included, so you'll want to have a pen if you don't have one handy. Okay, so while we talk, feel free to go to the bathroom, get more food or drink, go about as you please. We're going to continue. Today we will be discussing one of the most important historical events in history, if not the most important. It's the crux of the Christian faith, the miraculous bodily resurrection of the once dead Jesus of Nazareth. Tonight we're going to examine the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and we'll strive to look at the evidence intellectually as neutral historians. Though we will be citing and analyzing the biblical accounts, it's important to not just view everything through the Christian lens. The point today is to view everything neutrally without bias so that we can better understand the objections that people might raise. We understand that not all of you are skeptical, not all of you are historians, but I bet you know someone who has heard of some of the theories or explanations that we're going to present today. Those are huge stumbling blocks for people who believe the lie the culture has spread, that in order to believe Christianity, you need to leave history, facts, logic, and reason behind. That's just not true, and we intend to show you that today. We hope that you allow this information to give you confidence in Christianity and in the Bible, and to spur you to greater faith and inspire your interest in learning more. The evidence that we bring forward tonight, even skeptics and scholars who aren't Christians will consider credible. This evidence will allow us to establish the minimal facts, the most foundational, best evidenced facts surrounding the fate of Jesus. And as I said, virtually all scholars believe these to be true. We're not going to present to you anything that is contended. In the end, we believe that the intellectually honest approach to these minimal facts will lead the investigator to believe that the best explanation of the data is that Jesus rose from the dead. All that being said, this is our outline for tonight. As we discuss the information, feel free to raise your hand at the end of each slide if you have a question or you need clarification, and we'll do our best to address them. There will also be time at the end of each section, so at the end of section 4 and then the end of the second section 4 after the break. That we'll have time for questions there as well. Okay, so another disclaimer before we begin. Friends, we are not experts. We have put this material to present to you as a hobby of ours. It's something that interests us. But that being said, we have attended seminars, we've watched talks, listened to podcasts, read books, watched debates, and even taken credited college courses on some of the things that we will present to you tonight. But that being said, we don't have degrees in theology, historical analysis, and the like. So if you bring up any of the material that we present to you, don't cite us. We're not the people that you should be citing. We have a printout for you with the references that we have used, and we will also sometimes use some of the names of experts that come up with these specific hypotheses and such, and those are the people that you should reference, not us. In addition, we both wanted to apologize ahead of time because we're going to be referencing our notes quite heavily. We have a toddler, and we just didn't have time to memorize everything, but I hope that won't distract you from the talk. It is, yeah. Okay, so we won't pause anymore. Let's get going. Who's ready to dig their teeth in? The first part is that the resurrection is a key tenet of Christianity. There are multiple guarantees that the bodily resurrection of Jesus gives us as his followers that are explained in the Bible. We'll walk through each of these in more detail, but you can see them right off the bat. They're extremely important. First, the resurrection of Jesus ensures that we are forgiven of our sins. It ensures that we will have a future physical resurrection. And it ensures that we will have new spiritual glorified bodies at the end of the age when he returns. So let's look at the scriptures a little more closely. And we're going to go through these really quickly because I know that you know them already. Okay, so the first text is 1 Corinthians 15, 14, and 17. It reads, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation is in vain, and so is your faith. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, and you are still in your sins." So the connection here is, as we know, that if Jesus has not been raised, your faith is worthless, and you are still in your sins. Therefore, the resurrection ensures that we are forgiven of our sin because Jesus defeated it on the cross. The next is 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 22. "But as it is, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive." So Paul is clearly saying here that just as Adam's sin led to our sin and the death that sin brings, so too Jesus' resurrection guarantees our future resurrection. And number 3, 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 48. This is a long passage, so I'm just going to give you a summary. Scripture indicates here and in other passages as well that we will enjoy the same kind of glorified body that Jesus rose with. Just like the first man who was of dust, a natural body, Adam, so Christ is the last Adam, or the second man, who was raised with a spiritual glorified body. So in a nutshell, our hope of forgiveness of sins, of rising again with Jesus in new glorified bodies are all ensured by the resurrection. So it's something we ought to look very closely at since it's so integral to our faith. So the next point that we wanted to make tonight is that not only is resurrection a key foundational characteristic of Christianity, but it's also a distinguishing one. Apart from cults from Christianity like Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, no other religion believes that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. So this makes it something really important to be able to support and contend. So for example, we'll look at Islam. Islam teaches that Jesus was a good prophet. And because he was a good prophet, God would not have allowed him to die on the cross. That was a very shameful death that he did not deserve. The Quran states instead that he did not die on the cross, but instead only appeared to have died. So Islam, because the Quran doesn't exactly explain what that means, Islam gives a couple of theories as to what that might mean. Obviously, they believe that the Bible was corrupted and cannot be trusted, so they don't go to the Bible for reference there. First, they believe that Jesus could have had a spiritual body. This goes against everything in the Bible that shows that he was clearly physical, but the implication here was that he died spiritually on the cross. He did not physically have a body, and so the Quran would say that he only appeared to have died physically. Most of the Muslims, though, believe in the swoon theory, the second theory here. This is that Jesus fainted or swooned on the cross and then regained consciousness later in the tomb. So he didn't actually die, but instead he passed out and then came to once he was buried. Finally, the last option that they came up with is that Jesus was not on the cross, in fact. He only appeared to have been on the cross. And so this could have been a well-executed replacement done by his followers. Perhaps a couple of them agreed to have been killed instead. And most people who believe in the replacement theory also believe in the substitution theory, is that someone instead was killed on the cross and made to have looked like him by God. God supernaturally transformed them and made them into an illusion of Jesus. So here's what the Quran says, just as we were talking about. The Jews, and for boasting, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. But they neither killed him nor crucified him. It was only made to appear so. So there you go, the clear contradiction with Scripture. The Quran states that Jesus was not crucified, but instead it was made to have seemed so. So next, we'll take a quick look at the Jewish belief. Admittedly, I couldn't find much information about this. Jews tend to just dismiss the resurrection entirely. They avoid the topic, and they, of course, don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and so they don't see the sacredness or the validity in the New Testament. They do, of course, believe that he was crucified, however. That is a historical fact, as we will discuss. But it does them no misdeed to admit that he was crucified. He was just another deviant claiming to be the Messiah. And so he was killed for the sins against the nation. We do, however, have evidence in the Gospel of Matthew that the Jews began spreading a rumor after Jesus was resurrected. And that claims that the disciples stole the body and then claims that he was risen afterwards. So this is, of course, a belief that some Jews still hold today if they do take a stand. I have the text next for you. These can be in your notes. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's the Jews spread and said, "Say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping." And this is the story that has been told among the Jewish people to this day. Okay, so where does the story of the resurrection come from? It's a significant thing to the Christian faith, and it's distinguishing among religions. So how do we know what the origin of the account is? Can we trust the resurrection account? That's the underlying question here. Sure, we have scripture, and it says what it says, but is it accurate, or are there other extraneous factors influencing it? This is a debate, especially online, that you might hear about among people who claim to be scholars. Some of them claim that the resurrection was entirely made up or a product of legendary development. Let's start with a couple theories that claim that the story of Jesus' resurrection was fabricated. So the first claim that you might have heard of is that Jesus' resurrection is a retelling of mythology. Has anyone heard this one before? Okay, so it might be new to some of us. I first heard this probably 10 years ago. Someone in my Bible study, actually my Bible study leader, told me about this because it was something that she believed because she heard it in a college course. We're going to discuss a few key mythological figures, moving on from here, that some skeptics believe Jesus' resurrection was actually based on. As they're fairly straightforward, I'm going to do my best to try to just go really quickly through them because we have other important things to discuss. But these can all be verified with a quick Google search. So you have them in your notes. If someone brings this up to you, you'll be able to reference that or know the background of it at least. So the first one that we will talk about is Mithras. He is a god who originated around the 3rd century BCE. so well before Jesus. And he's a figure in the Iranian religion Zoroastrianism. He's the god of light, truth, and contracts. So you might see here why people at face value might compare him to Jesus. He became the focus of a mysterious cult known as Mithraism. What you need to know is that there isn't much known about the cult, and so people draw a bunch of made-up theories about them. The theory that Jesus was actually a retelling of the story of the god Mithras was invented in the 18th century by French professor Charles and politician Constantine. I can't pronounce the rest of their names. The theory was also presented in a bunch of other books and movies, such as the movie Zeitgeist, if you've ever heard of that movie. It's extremely popular among critics. It's really without much warrant once you look at the facts, so let's look at it quickly here. So it's largely debated as to whether Mithras was born on December 25th. I will say that this is probably based on the fact that there was a sun festival at the time, and the Mithraism cult also worships the god of the sun. So it could be that he was born on the 25th. It could have been because of this festival. We don't know. But either way, it doesn't quite matter because Jesus' resurrection has nothing to do with December the 25th. And the Bible does not reference December the 25th either. So there's a story about the sun god where he tells Mithras to sacrifice a bull. In the story, he does so, but unwillingly. He looks away in a dramatic fashion, somewhat downcast. And at the sacrifice of the bull, the material creation occurs. This includes the moon, the stars, grapes, animals, fish. And the cult essentially worships this scene often. You'll see it a lot in the artifacts that are displaying this sacrifice. It's one of the most commonly known things about the cult. It's also said that Mithras was born as an adult man from a rock in a cave. Little is known about that, and it has nothing to do with Jesus. There is no precise death narrative as well. So as you can see, there's a lack of a connection between Mithras and Jesus. Okay, so next is the Egyptian god Osiris. Osiris is said to be the lord of death and rebirth. So you can see, again, why people might connect him to Jesus. The first evidence of his worship was in the 25th century BC, so well before Christianity developed. The theory that Jesus is a retelling of Osiris was propagated by Sir James George Fraser, a Scottish anthropologist. He proposed this in a book of comparative religion called The Golden Bough. The theory essentially says that there is an archetype of the dying and rising God that is presented among most religions. And so it creates a kind of category that there's some ancient mythological figure that predated all of these religious figures. And the story of Jesus can be lumped into this archetype. So it's a way of explaining away the resurrection and why it appears in the Bible. So let's take a closer look at what Osiris is known for. Osiris, in the story goes, is killed by his brother Set and possibly some co-conspirators seeking to usurp his throne as king. One version of the story says he's tricked into getting in a box and then thrown in the Nile. Set then chops up his body into as many as 42 pieces and hides them throughout Egypt. Isis finds the pieces, either all of them or all but one, and embalms them back together. And he comes alive, but only for a moment. But some of the tellings of this story don't even have him coming back to life. Afterwards, though, he's always shown as appearing then as the Lord of the underworld. So the differences here are that Osiris is killed instead of crucified. He's chopped up into millions of pieces. He's embalmed in order to bring him back to life. And some don't even claim that he was brought back to life. The important difference, though, is that it's not a physical resurrection. It's a spiritual resurrection because he appears then as Lord of the underworld. Okay, so next, Adonis. Adonis is actually a mortal man who is supposedly the lover of a few female Greek gods. You may also hear him by his Semitic name Tammuz. He was first worshipped in the 600 BC, so again, well before Christ. He is another that people lump into the archetype of the dying and rising God. Adonis was born by his mother's incestual relationship. When driven out of her home, she turns into a tree, and the baby Adonis is found by Aphrodite and fostered by Persephone in the underworld. When he's grown, he's very handsome, and they both want to be with him. Aphrodite lives with the gods and Persephone in the underworld. To solve this dispute, Zeus says that he can spend half of the time with each. And so it's not really a death and a resurrection. He's said to be seasonally reborn between the underworld and between the land of the gods. He's later killed by a wild boar while hunting and dies in Aphrodite's arms. So there's no clear crucifixion account, and there's no clear resurrection either. He dies a real physical death and does not come back after that. The fact that he's called the god of the seasons doesn't really matter in terms of our resurrection. Okay, next is the god Attis. This is a Turkish god of seasonal vegetation. His first evidence of worship was in 1250 BC in Turkey, and he was later incorporated into the Greek culture around the 4th century BC. It's really strange, but the connection between Jesus and Attis began to be established sometime after Jesus' time by Christian authors. This is true for some of the other gods as well. For some reason, the Christian authors wanted to see the connection with Christ in the story, and so began incorporating the details into the myths. There are a few extremely different variations of the story of Attis, so I'm going to present to you, hopefully, one that makes sense. Attis was born to a mother who abandoned him. He was raised by a goat, as well as later some foster parents, including the goddess Cybele. Once he was old enough, he was sent into the city to marry King Midas's daughter. During the ceremony, Cybele suddenly shone her transcendent godly form, and Attis went mad and killed himself. This was an accident, and so Cybele begged Zeus to preserve his body. It was hard to find the information, but I think that he gets turned into a tree or is resuscitated by Zeus so that his pinky twitched. Either way, he's celebrated as the god of the seasons and is said to be reborn every year, though I'm not sure how people get that out of the story of his life. Maybe it's because he's a tree. At the very maximum, it's all a yearly occurrence and not once and for all, and maybe a birth and death repetition, not a resurrection or a crucifixion. Surely not a resurrection because it's just a pinky. Okay, so next is Dionysus, the Greek lord of wine and pleasure and theater, the total opposite of Jesus. The first evidence of cult worship of Dionysus was in Greece around 1300 BC, but there's some evidence to suggest that it might be even earlier. The cult was established by the 7th century BC. He's, again, another archetype of this dying and rising god. There are many versions of the story, so I'm going to present to you the two most common. In one version of the story, Dionysus was born to Zeus and a mortal woman, Semele, who was not his wife. When Zeus's wife found out that she was pregnant, she tricked him into asking Zeus to show her his godly form. When he did, she couldn't stand it, and she died. Zeus saw the fetus, picked it up, and sewn it into his thigh until he was born, they say, a second time. He is raised by nymphs and satyrs in order to avoid the jealousy of Zeus's real wife. Another version of the story has Zeus having an affair with a different woman who is an actual god, and she gives birth to Dionysus. Zeus's wife, again, is jealous and asks the Titans to tear him into pieces. Zeus's mother is then said to have found the pieces, put him back together, and brings him back to life, though that's not explained how. Some versions intertwine the two, so he is torn to pieces by the Titans and then put together, but as a drink, and then given to the mortal woman Semele, who then is tricked and she dies because she sees Zeus in his real form, and then he's sewn into Zeus's thigh. There's a lot of intricacies going in here. So the differences here are clear. The first story has almost nothing to do with Jesus. Sewn into his thigh, second birth, it doesn't matter. In the second, there's no crucifixion. He's killed by the Titans and torn into pieces. He's not resurrected either. He's said to have been born twice in the first account and then brought back to life miraculously somehow by the power of the God in the second account. Again, an important thing to draw here, especially about the second account, is he's not brought back to life of his own power, and it's not for any real reason. Okay, so even though we were able to discount all of these myths as not being similar to the resurrection, a few points still need to be made here. Even if the Jews were to create a story of a mythic savior to be worshipped, they would not have copied the stories told by these pagan cultures. This is very literally described in Ezekiel 8 here, where the prophet is seeing an angel, or an angel is showing them some women weeping about the god Tammuz, or you'll remember Adonis. And that being a comparison for how detestable things had become for Israel. So it says here, "Do you see this, son of man? You will see even more detestable acts than these," talking about the worship of the god Tammuz. So it's clear that they would not have copied from these pagan cultures. In summary, William Lane Craig puts it best: this is just misinformation that is disseminated in popular media that isn't characteristic of scholarship on ancient mythology and religion. Okay, so let's move on to our second objection about the origin of the resurrection account. That's that Jesus' resurrection is just a conspiracy invented by people seeking power. Has anyone heard this one before? Yeah, this one's very common. Some believe that the church made up the notion that Jesus rose from the dead, but they did so in order to gain political and social power. There are several problems with this conspiracy theory, starting with the undisputed fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus' crucifixion was a crushing blow to his identity. If you remember when the two disciples on the road to Emmaus said in Luke 24:21, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." The Jews believed the Messiah was supposed to be a conquering military figure who would overthrow the Romans and reestablish Israel's sovereignty. Inventing a crucifixion would not have gained them any popularity with the Jews. Even more, Jesus had some very powerful enemies who very clearly opposed his movement. The Jewish leadership and Romans were ready to stomp out any other movement by Jesus' followers after his death. The Romans wanted to keep the status quo and avoid possible uprisings in their provinces. They already had power. They didn't support new religious movements, especially not the Christian movement, which worshipped a man as Lord. Only Caesar was supposed to be called Lord. There was no power to be gained by inventing a resurrection with the Romans. Next, we don't see clear political or financial intent, as the church was peaceful and not a military movement, so they weren't seeking political gain. Instead, Christians experienced persecution very soon after the death of Christ. For example, Roman historian Tacitus, who we're going to bring up later on, he wrote a book called the Annals, 112 and 113, and wrote about the persecution of Christians by Nero in the 60s AD. This is likely the time that Peter and Paul were martyred. A Roman governor named Pliny the Younger also wrote about how the Christians were criminally charged for their faith. So that's just an example of how persecution happened right away, and we have other historical figures attesting to this. Okay, so lean into this next one. One of the most common objections is that the Roman Emperor Constantine founded Christianity as the religion it is today, thereby creating it and giving it extreme political power. This is one that I've heard often, especially among university students, and so it's quite dangerous. The implication here is that Christianity prior to Constantine was dramatically different than what it looks like now. The claim states that Constantine essentially invented Christianity's key tenets, including the resurrection, in order to gain mental control over people in his land. Instead, what we know about Constantine's intersection with Christianity is that historical sources report that Constantine claimed to have had a vision, and you'll hear about the vision often if you talk to these people. He had a vision at the Battle of Malvern Hill against his political rival in 312 AD. From his vision, he interpreted that God wanted him to put the Greek letters chi and rho on his soldiers' shields, which are the first letters of Christ in Greek. Some claim that this is the time when Constantine converted, but it's much messier than that. He continued to function as high priest of pagan worship, which was still the official religion of the Roman Empire throughout his whole life. Contrary to what people might say, Christianity did not become the official religion of the empire until 60 years after his death. He was only baptized on his deathbed. Now, it's true that he did alleviate some state-endorsed persecution by the church, and he allowed them to gather openly in councils, such as the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Importantly, however, he did not oversee these councils. He also gradually increased government tolerance of the church and provided government support for the church during the end of his reign. So while it's true that he alleviated some persecution for Christians, he in no way reshaped the doctrine of the faith, and he did not have any real involvement in the Council of Nicaea. Okay, so from this evidence we've discussed so far, the resurrection is not a retelling of an old pagan myth. It doesn't make sense to claim that Jesus' followers made up the idea of Jesus' resurrection for political gain, or that it was developed by later figures like Constantine. Some may then claim that the New Testament we have today was corrupted and is different from what the original documents say. That is, that at some point Christians or scribes conspired to alter the text and change the Christian message. However, manuscripts are handwritten documents that scribes meticulously copy. Some people try to throw out manuscript evidence by saying it's kind of like the telephone game, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. But this is an inaccurate analogy. Written transmission and successive copying of information is different than oral transmission. Scribes were devoted to their work at hand because this was a holy text for them. They were held accountable for even the smallest variation, and they saw it as their own personal holy work. With that in mind, the New Testament is far and away the best attested ancient document, with almost 6,000 Greek manuscripts. For comparison, one of the other best attested is Homer's Iliad, which has 2,000. The New Testament manuscripts we have are dated close to the writing of the original documents. This itself shows how early Christians treasured these writings and sought to preserve them right away. The huge abundance of available manuscripts also allows textual critics to compare one to the other and say with a high degree of certainty that we essentially have what was originally written. In addition, the manuscripts have been found all over the Roman Empire, an area which at its height stretched about 2,500 miles east to west and 1,500 miles north to south. This is significant because the first 300 years of its existence, the church did not have a clear geopolitical center, meaning that scribes all over the empire were transcribing separately from one another and did not have a clear center in which to communicate. In this way, it would have been impossible to collude in order to alter the documents. As an aside, our oldest New Testament manuscripts predate Constantine's reign by hundreds of years. These manuscripts proclaim the death, resurrection, and lordship of Jesus with all of its theological significance. With the validity of the key text established, let's evaluate the historical record regarding the fate of Jesus. We will develop this more formally as we go on, but the oral tradition of the church states that Jesus rose from the dead. These were in preserved creeds, which are short summary statements of main Christian beliefs found in the New Testament. Many scholars date and the composition of these creeds to within 5 years of the resurrection. Pay really close attention to these because we're going to bring them up again and again. They are so important. In addition to these creeds, we have Paul's letters, the Gospels, and other letters which claim that Jesus rose from the dead. All of these historical documents were written while eyewitnesses were still alive, meaning that they could confirm or deny the claims in the documents. Biblical scholar William Lane Craig points out that historians of antiquity think that they've hit pay dirt when they have at least 2 independent sources reporting on an event. Here we have well over 2. And they're very, very close to the time that the event happened. So here next is a quote from Bart Ehrman, who's a well-known New Testament scholar. He's agnostic, so while he does not believe in Jesus and was actually risen in the faith, He does not believe that Jesus rose from the dead and is highly critical of that claim. He's one of the most famous critics to the Christian religion. And he says the following about the history of the New Testament. If historians want to know what Jesus said or did, they are more or less constrained to use the New Testament Gospels as their principal resources. Let me emphasize that this is not for religion or theological reasons. It's for historical reasons, pure and simple. Okay, so we have something really unique in the Bible. It is in some ways a historical book that can be evaluated in that way. With so much documentation about a single event, the resurrection is one of the most well-supported events in ancient human history. So here's the part where we have to begin to be honest. If we're going to move forward with thinking and discussing the Bible as a historical document, we need to be intellectually honest and try our best to not bring too much of our worldview into the mix. We want to evaluate the data and discuss the evidence in a way that will allow us to think clearly about it and consider ways that agnostics or others might approach the text. Let's be willing to evaluate all of the evidence put forth here with openness so that we can learn and think together. So what are some of the objections to the resurrection? Some of these are sometimes philosophical objections. We don't have time tonight to cover all of the possible objections, but we believe the following are the most common that you might hear. Objection number 1, it hasn't happened any other time in history. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, the Bible reports that several other people were raised from the dead. And that's true. While we believe that other people have raised from the dead, it was never from their own power. That aside, this objection is really assuming modern history, not history reported in the Bible or ancient history. Part of the problem with this objection is that it treats historical knowledge as if it were scientific knowledge. The underlying argument here is that for an important event to happen once in history, it must have happened before in a similar manner. It measures the likelihood of something having occurred based on its repeatability. But that's inherently not how historical knowledge works. The fact that something might be a rare occurrence does not negate the fact that it actually happened historically. So comparing the two, scientific knowledge is based on theories that are repeatable, observable, and measurable. The scientific method encompasses things that can be manipulated in a controllable way. Historical knowledge, on the other hand, is the study and extraction of evidence that we could label as residue of the past. Historical knowledge is based on critical methods as well, which we'll talk about later. And those can demonstrate what most likely happened according to a couple of varying degrees of certainty. However, we will give this objection a little bit of ground because a resurrection is an extremely rare and improbable event. So we should proceed with caution before assuming that a document that says that someone rose from the dead, that it's true. That being said, unique rare events do occur. For example, the Battle of Dunkirk during World War II. British intelligence estimated that they could evacuate 30,000 soldiers, and instead they evacuated 330,000 soldiers. That's a very clear, unlikely rare event. And if you were to approach it like this hypothesis suggests, you would say that they made the numbers up. Finally, this kind of probability assessment is really only relevant for events that have naturalistic explanations or an explanation based on natural laws. It's observably true that people don't rise from the dead because of natural causes, of course. So because the resurrection is in itself a miracle, God has to intervene. Because he created natural laws, God is above them all, and so he can do it. This kind of leads into our next theory, is that miracles are impossible. This objection, of course, has some essence of truth in it as well. Think about the definition of impossible. The word itself means something cannot happen. So we have to clearly define about what impossible things are and how impossible things can happen in order for us to address this question. So like we've alluded to, miracles are only impossible if atheism is true. So miracles in themselves are improbable occurrences that, depending on your outlook, would require God to intervene. But if God does exist, then miracles are certainly possible. This is really just a statement or objection of worldview. A reasonable historian would enter an investigation of miracle claims by minimizing as many worldviews as possible, as we're trying to do today. Therefore, the assertion that miracles are impossible is not a fair assumption during historical analysis. We have to be driven by the facts in front of us, and we can't make worldview claims like this. Dr. William Lane Craig has another quote here. "There is nothing impossible about miracles if God exists. Partially, the evidence for the resurrection is the existence of God who designed the universe and created all people. For a creator of the universe, the odd resurrection is child's play." Okay, claim number 3. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Have you guys heard this one as well? It's very catchy and popular, and at face value sounds very reasonable. The statement implies this, that because an event is unlikely, I should require more evidence for me to believe that it occurred. First, demanding extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims is unjustified because it's arbitrary. How do you know when you've reached the level of extraordinary evidence? Who decides what ordinary evidence is and what's extraordinary evidence? That enters the realm of subjectivity, and we try to keep our analysis as objective as possible. Secondly, like we've already said, follow the evidence. If a miracle claim possesses strong evidence in support of it, it increases the plausibility of the claim. The fact that there is supporting evidence for something so unlikely gives the evidence a little bit more weight. Consequently, the burden of proof should shift to the alternate hypothesis. If no strong alternate hypothesis surfaces with good evidential support, then it's plausible that the alternative hypothesis is unlikely and the miracle claim is likely. Lastly, Dr. William Lane Craig, you've seen his name already a couple times, calls us to consider that there are some pragmatic reasons for believing. He gives a kind of retelling of Pascal's wager, if you've ever heard of that. So, for example, imagine that you're diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer with only a few months left to live and no real treatment options available. Well, that is, there's one treatment option, but it's very, very unlikely that you'll survive. There are only a couple people who have ever survived who have taken this treatment. You would be and pretend if you take the treatment and you believe it's going to work, it's more likely that it actually will work. In this case, it would be a pragmatic reason for believing that if you took this treatment, it would work because it would increase the probability of it working. In other words, if eternity is at stake for believing or not believing in the resurrection, you may require lesser evidence in order to believe it because the rewards highly outweigh the risk. Does that make sense? Okay, objection number 4. The Bible is not historically reliable and it's biased. Why would I even trust it? So we're moving away here from more general philosophical objections to specific objections to the resurrection claim. Let's deal with the question of historical accuracy first. As a historical document, the Bible's historical accuracy can be tested. At a minimum, all of its geographical and political references are verifiable by comparing with other historical documents and archaeological findings. Its literary style, the way it cites sources, uses literary devices, and other grammatical things within the text are also accurate and reflective of the time. Numerous scholars in particular have noted that Luke, who wrote both Luke and Acts, was an excellent historian, and where he can be tested, his claims are historically accurate. Dr. Michael Licona, again, has compared the Gospels with a contemporary historical figure of the time. He compared the Gospel of Mark with the Life of Augustus, which is a Greco-Roman biography written by the Roman historian Suetonius. Suetonius, in particular, is very well respected by scholars because he wrote with a specific concern for precision and accuracy. So in his article, Dr. Licona shows that the Gospel of Mark is just as, if not more, historically reliable than the life of Augustus. And that's just an example, a specific example of how the Gospels are reliable. So hidden also within this objection is that there's an allegation that the human authors of the Bible were biased and therefore untrustworthy. So let's get something straight. Everyone is biased. Just the fact's absolute neutrality does not exist within humanity or the human mind. A reporter who does her best to cover what actually happened in an article has at very minimum to be selective with what she includes in the article. You can't in any way include literally everything that happens. So neutrality jumps out the window. Everyone has inherent beliefs and assumptions in their worldview that influence your conclusions. So to throw out the Bible because the authors are biased would be to throw out our ability to know anything historical, since the problem with bias is not exclusive to the biblical authors, but would be including any author in general. Also, the resurrection didn't exactly meet the expectations of the authors of the Bible. Some of the biblical authors were former enemies of the Christian movement, like Paul. And Jesus' disciples also had to alter their expectations of what a Messiah would look like. So they're not arguing for something they always believed, but arguing after a major worldview shift. On a final note, while bias is always a factor in historical investigation and evaluating source reliability, it's possible to detect undue influence in the writer's bias through historical method, just as it's possible to distinguish history from propaganda. We'll unpack this more later, but for example, if an author is willing to admit something embarrassing about himself or his friends, then it's more likely that it's true. So, and we're going to talk about that ad nauseum, but I'm sure you can already think of a couple examples that come to mind from the Bible. Okay, everyone still tracking? Okay, so the last objection here is that there are legendary developments within the Gospels. And this is one that has been widely spread, especially by the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman that we talked about earlier. This is the allegation that the Gospels incorporated legendary development as time moved on. So the objection is long, so stay with me here. It begins this way. Mark was the first gospel to be written, which almost all New Testament scholars believe to be true. Matthew and Luke were written next, and then John was written last. Mark is the shortest gospel, and in some ways presents as simple compared to the other ones because they have more details included. The argument then is that the Christology, or the author's portrait of Jesus, is more human in Mark than it is in Matthew and Luke, and definitely less in John, which has a very high Christology, meaning that John is very forward about Jesus being God. They draw this from the fact that there's no resurrection appearances of Jesus in Mark, and it grows from there, with the most occurring in John, which is also the last book written. From this, again, the argument is that over time, the legend of Jesus slowly changed and incorporated the resurrection account. There are some things that we can agree with on here. We believe that Matthew and Luke add new material and elaborate on material that Mark already reported on, because Mark was a very short gospel in the first one. We agree that John's Christology is higher than Mark's and highest of the four gospels. But Mark's Christology is higher than many assume, as several claims in Mark 1 through 6, and again in Mark 14, illustrate that Mark identifies Jesus as God. So he does have a Christology. For the purpose in evaluating the fate of Jesus, his death and resurrection, we admit that you do see more post-resurrection appearances of Jesus in the later Gospels. There is no narrated post-mortem appearance of that in Mark. However, Dr. Mike Licona, Dr. Craig Keener, and others have contended with good evidence that we have implied post-resurrection appearance of Jesus in Mark. We don't have time to fully unpack this, but Mark 14:28, Jesus says to the apostles before his death, "But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee and meet you there." Later, an angel told the women at the empty tomb in Mark 16:7, "Tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there just as he told you." It's kind of like a rhetorical question in Mark. Mark clearly believes that Jesus is the Messiah in addition to being God. So if he includes these texts, the implication is that those appearances really did happen in Galilee and later. Importantly, the objection also ignores the earlier and historically speaking better source, Paul's letters. 1 Corinthians 15 was written about 15 years before Mark, and it reports 6 appearances of the risen Jesus. Paul also has a very high Christology and identifies Jesus as God in Philippians 2 and 1 Corinthians 8, among many other places. And all of these were written before these gospel accounts, including Mark. Finally, this theory of legendary development is skewed. While John may have more post-resurrection appearances of Jesus and more direct claims to divinity, Mark reports Jesus performing 2.5 more miracles than John does. So while there's some bits of truth in this claim, it does not clearly encompass all of the facts that we have about the Gospels and other writings. Okay, so now I hope that we agree that the resurrection account is one that is not based on artificial information and shouldn't be bogged down by unattainable philosophical objections. It deserves a proper look because of its importance to the Christian faith, historical nature, and general reliability. So let's talk about how historians investigate historical documents. We're beginning the historical method. Let's go. If you're feeling a little tired, don't worry. We have a 10-minute break coming up soon. Everyone give someone at the table a high five. You're almost there. All right. So historians use tools in their investigation called criteria of authenticity that we have listed here. If criteria of authenticity are met, it adds to source reliability and strengthens the historical event in question. We're going to go through each of these criteria and discuss how they're reflected in the Bible and in the resurrection accounts. Okay, the first criteria is multiple attestation. This is when an event has 2 or more sources written about it. We have here 5 primary sources that report on the resurrection: the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. New Testament scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a primary source. Because of that, these 3 are often considered just as one complete source. Acts. Luke provides us with a lot of very useful information on the apostolic teaching of the resurrection, with Peter's sermon at Pentecost in Acts 2 as an example. John. While most scholars believe that John knew of the other Gospels, they also agree that he wrote independently, and so he's incorporated as an independent source. And then the Pauline epistles. Paul's letters are an excellent historical source. Not only did he claim to be an eyewitness of the resurrection, but he personally spoke with and confirmed his teachings with Peter, John, the other apostles, and James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, and here are the early creeds again. The oral formula are short summary statements found in the New Testament that were developed by the church in Jerusalem and were meant to be memorized and spoken in worship, and created likely only a few years after the resurrection. Okay, so if anyone has memorized Philippians 2, 5 through 11, we recommend that this one is your next one for memorization. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. If you only remember a couple things, remember the value of this creed. Virtually all New Testament scholars recognize verses 3 through 5 to be the original creed, and some suggest that the others were added later, but a lot do agree as well that the verses 6 through 7 were also part of the original creed. 8, of course, was added by Paul. As a historical source, this is pure gold. Most scholars believe that this is probably the earliest, if not the earliest, testimony of Jesus' resurrection. Very conservative dating puts it as at about 5 years from the resurrection. The creed is most definitely developed by the church in Jerusalem, and Paul received it directly from the apostles during his trip to Jerusalem in Galatians 1 through 2. And as you can clearly see in verse 4, it says raised on the third day. We're not going to read all of them because we just don't have time. Okay, the second creed, Romans 1, 3 through 4, is from the Jerusalem church and is preserved here. We are not exactly sure when this creed was developed, but it's again likely that Paul received it from the apostles during one of his trips to Jerusalem, talked about in Galatians 1 through 2. So it's somewhere between 3 and 20 years after the resurrection, because he receives it from them again. Okay, and finally, this one doesn't read as much as like a creed, but it's Luke 24:34. This is dated similarly, and it's most important because it offers multiple attestation of Jesus' individual appearance to Peter, which is also in the 1 Corinthians Creed. And as you can see, it says, he has truly been raised and appeared to Simon. Okay, so next we have the criterion of early attestation. As the name implies, a source that is written as close to as possible to when an event took place is preferred over a source written later, which makes total sense. On our timeline, we've placed the biblical historical sources to be used in the investigation. Scholars debate over when exactly they were written. These above are later dates for the writing of these documents and the ones preferred by skeptics. Some think that they were probably written earlier, but even if the skeptics are correct, these are very early historical sources, and all were written when eyewitnesses could confirm or deny what has been written in the document. A.N. Sherman White contends that it takes more than 2 generations to wipe out what he terms a historical core, or the key truths within a story or an event. This means that historical documents written more than 2 generations after an event could have the historical core compromised and may be subject to legendary development. All of these documents written here are written within the first generation after the events they were reported on, not even close to 2 generations later. Of course, early direct eyewitness testimony is the ideal source. We have that in the Pauline epistles, as he claimed to be an eyewitness to the resurrection and wrote directly on it. We have it indirectly in the apostles through Paul in the creeds. We have that directly in the Gospels with Mark, Peter as the primary source, and John, who's also an eyewitness. And those are especially noted by scholars. That's why I pointed them out in particular. But all of these here are eyewitnesses except for Luke, who used Peter as a source. Okay, our last criterion before our break is enemy attestation. This is when a historical event has enemies who provide testimony about it. Here's where we're going to start to get all historical on you, okay? So any historical testimony from enemies on an event is considered to make it more likely to have happened. In the case of Jesus, we have testimony from enemies who were at minimum non-Christians and in some cases antagonistic towards Christianity. There are more sources than are listed, but these are considered the best sources. And we're going to talk about them again, so tuck their names in your back pocket. So let's start with Josephus. He was Jewish and born in Jerusalem around 37 AD and lived there until 70 AD when Jerusalem fell to the Romans. He then moved to Rome and wrote as a historian. His father was a priest, and Josephus's family belonged to the religious elite. In his autobiography, he expressed that he was very interested in spiritual matters and was even a Pharisee from the ages 19 to 26. He likely knew firsthand of the church activities around 50 to 70 AD and is therefore a very valuable source. He's considered here an enemy because he's not a Christian, he's a Jew. Tacitus was a Roman historian considered to be the greatest of all Roman historians. He wrote the Annals, which we talked about earlier, a history of the Roman Empire in around 116 AD. He not only mentions Jesus and his death, but speaks very critically of Christians. If you have time later, then we can read a couple of the texts. So these are important because they're enemy attestation of Jesus, his crucifixion, his death, and Christianity and how it flourished afterwards.
So we're going to keep going with our review of the criteria of historical authenticity. So next criteria we've got here is called criterion of embarrassment. So Paige mentioned this one earlier, but the idea here is that if a source who is the actual eyewitness or the reporter, or so if that reporter tells embarrassing information about either himself or about his friends or his allies, that's when this criterion is thought to be met, because these people are willing to admit something embarrassing about themselves. We know this from our own lives. If you're going to make up a lie about yourself, then you're not going to include embarrassing information. Everybody wants to make themselves look the best. You know, we tailor crop selfies, same kind of principle with what we admit about ourselves. So in the same way, if historians are looking and they see again the presence of embarrassing information that's again coming directly from the source about himself or from his friends about the source, it fills that criteria, and it also shows, like Paige said, that we should take this source a little more seriously. They're willing to admit embarrassing information. They're sticking to the truth, even if it makes them look bad. So some biblical examples that we have for this here are, like Paige mentioned, Paul was a former enemy of Christ and the Christian faith, and he's not shy about that. In Galatians, in Philippians, in other places, and Luke reports this as well to us in Acts, he clearly tells us about what he used to be like, what he used to do, that he hated Jesus and wanted to destroy the church. Also, you read a little more closely, James, the brother of Jesus, we also see that he was, at minimum, an unbeliever. I think we can call him a former enemy of Jesus, especially if you look at the way John talks about him. So, if James is called a pillar of the church by Paul in Galatians 2, and many scenes in Acts you see James in this position of leadership at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, for example, why would the early church make up that the half-brother of Jesus was not a believer when Jesus was around if it wasn't true? It doesn't make any sense. So that's another example. Now, we're going to cover the women being the first witnesses of the empty tomb and exactly how that fulfills the criteria of embarrassment later. For starters, in first century Palestine, and even in Greek culture as well, women's testimony was viewed as inferior. So the idea that women were the first witnesses of the tomb to that audience was viewed as kind of embarrassing. And then finally, one more good example in Matthew 28. We have a note that when Jesus appeared to his disciples at a mountain in Galilee, that some of them doubted. So there's an admission again by people who were involved in the writing of the text that they did doubt. Can anybody think of any more examples of embarrassing information that's in Scripture? Andrew. Yes, and remember, like Paige said, we have really good historical reason to think that Mark used Peter as his primary source, and that's in Mark. So Peter's not concealing that about himself. Very good example. All right, so next slide here, next criterion rather, is the criterion of contextual credibility. So the criterion of contextual credibility, we get a little more nuanced here, but stick with me. This criterion is said to have been met when we see certain characteristics in the written Greek text that show that they are stemming from like a Jewish or an Aramaic or a Palestinian background. So here's an example. Paige and I used to serve an international student ministry in Buffalo. And in that ministry, we met a lot of friends from India. And one very unique way that they all had this unique expression that they said, instead of saying or asking us, have you arrived yet, or did you make it home yet, they would say, did you reach? Have you reached yet? And obviously in context, we knew what they were saying, but it didn't sound natural to us with American English as our native language. So in the same way here, people who know Greek well read certain things in the New Testament and they notice, there's like an Aramaic flavor to this Greek text. It leaves a residue that's noticeable. That's important because it gives really strong indicators that passages that have these Aramaic or Jewish or Palestinian characteristics, they have an early origin from Jesus' Aramaic-speaking disciples. So text with these features also was originally composed as oral, kind of like the creeds we were talking about earlier, not written. And that makes sense because most likely, at least from a historian's perspective, Jesus' disciples were probably illiterate, with the exception during the earthly ministry portion of their lives, with the exception being Matthew. He was a tax collector, so he would have had to have known how to read and write. All right, so some examples of this criteria that we see. So the early Christian creeds, like Paige has already talked to us about. Again, these appear, scholars note, to have characteristics showing that they were composed orally, not in writing, with the way they're written. They also show, again, there's Aramaic influence in terms of the vocabulary, in terms of the grammar, structure, etc. Matthew 16:17. After Peter states that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Bar is an Aramaic word. It means son. That's actually, though, in the Greek text. Like, if you go in the Greek manuscripts, bar is there, not the Greek word for son. Also, we have an Aramaic or a Jewish way of speaking, son of Jonah. That's a very Jewish expression. And then finally, in Mark, we have numerous passages. I counted at least 6 where there's direct quotes of Jesus speaking in Aramaic as well. So final criterion that historians use for investigating the fate of Jesus is the criterion of dissimilarity. So again, nuance, but the idea here is that if we have information or titles that are used in the Gospels, but not in the rest of the New Testament, so the letters, Acts, Revelation, etc., then skeptical scholars, especially of the New Testament, seem to think that that information was in the Gospels but not elsewhere because the early church thought it was either embarrassing or somehow not useful. So because of that, criterion of embarrassment kind of idea, it seems to these skeptical scholars that that information is probably more historical. So again, we also have it kind of as a double fulfillment here. The women as first witnesses of the empty tomb. If you look closely, you will only see the women mentioned as the first witnesses of the empty tomb in the Gospels. Not mentioned in the Pauline epistles, not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. Jesus also, his usage of the term Son of Man. You do not see the Son of Man elsewhere in the New Testament. And finally, in the sign at Jesus' crucifixion that Pilate has placed, King of the Jews, that's a title of Jesus only used in the Gospels, not in the rest of the New Testament. Jesus is called, just for clarity, King of Kings, Revelation, but not King of the Jews again. So we think there are probably some theological reasons why we have the dissimilarity between these elements of dissimilarity between the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament. For example, maybe Paul, in writing to a Gentile audience, chose not to use a term Son of Man that was very charged to the Jewish reader who knows Daniel 7 well and what Jesus is referring to. But a Gentile maybe gets the point much more clear if Paul uses a term like King of Kings. But that being said, historians don't get involved in theological interpretation. So for the historian, this dissimilarity between the Gospels and the New Testament, where we see that dissimilarity, I should say, that shows for them signs of reliability. All right, so we're not going to go over these criteria right now. That's for later. I did want you to know, though, that there's kind of a second pack of criteria that historians use. Once they've established facts, there's then criteria of the best explanation that they use to actually evaluate hypotheses. Again, we'll get into this later. Both of these are on the summary sheets, by the way, that we gave you. But I just wanted you to know this kind of completes historical method, but we'll discuss it further later, just so it's fresher in our minds when we actually do evaluate the hypotheses. All right, so we've gotten through the method, gotten through all the technique stuff. Let's get to the fun stuff. Let's actually talk about our sources. All right, so these are on the timeline above. The page actually had earlier for us. These are the main sources for the fate of Jesus that historians use. Bart Ehrman, again, being a skeptical scholar, he uses these sources. Doesn't matter if he doesn't believe in the resurrection. He knows these are the best historical sources, and he goes to these. So these are primarily, you'll notice, again, these are all scriptural sources. We can call them canonical as well. They're in the canon of Scripture. There are a few other non-canonical sources we'll use, but again, like Paige said, these are the later dates or later date ranges for the writing of these Gospels. But even if they are written in these later dates, then even a skeptic would have to admit that they're written early compared to other ancient sources that claim to have early attestation. Furthermore, we also see that, no, that's okay. So, like Paige had said, eyewitnesses were still around to confirm or deny what was written in all of these documents. There was one scholar, Dr. McIver, Robert McIver, who did kind of a population estimate of first century Palestine, and he concluded that there were around 13,000 eyewitnesses to the death and resurrection of Jesus that were around when Mark was written in around 65. And even though John, 60 years later, seems maybe like it's late for face value, there were still more than 600 witnesses still around to confirm what was written. John himself being an eyewitness as well, by the way. That's not to mention all the eyewitnesses that were obviously around shortly after the resurrection when the creeds were composed, and then during Paul's letters as well. Remember again, the historian A.N. Sherwin White that Paige mentioned, he claims that it takes more than 2 generations to wipe out his historical course. So the basic facts of what happened to a person in his life of an importance that Jesus had, for example. But we again have all of these sources that are written within 1 generation. All right, so again, like Paige mentioned, there are more non-Christian sources. You can Google search and find, I think, at least 6 that have some value in terms of their mention of Jesus. But these are clearly the best 2. Paige already talked about Josephus some. What I will say as well before we get into Josephus is that you'll hear some people kind of complain, well, none of the non-Christian sources say that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, if they didn't, they wouldn't be non-Christian or enemy anymore, obviously. I do know one exception, actually, though, just as an aside. There's a modern Jewish scholar named Pinchas Lapid. Interestingly enough, he looked into the evidence of the resurrection, thought it definitely, historically, Jesus rose from the dead, but he kind of has a funny way of looking at the evidence and says that Jesus was a savior for the Gentiles, and Pinchas Lapid's a Jew, so he's not a Christian. But besides that, again, that's just a funny exception. But Josephus, again, was Jewish, like Paige said. He was born in Jerusalem around 37. Remember, his father was a priest. Josephus belonged to the religious elite. He became a Pharisee around age 19 to 26. And again, he knew very well firsthand of church activity happening between 50 and 70. He mentions, or rather, he moves to Rome in 70, and he lives there until he dies in around 100. And it's there that he writes as a historian. So he's writing all this stuff while he's in Rome. And he mentions Jesus twice in his book that we're going to go over in a second in Antiquities. First in chapter 18, and then again in chapter 20. And we'll get into chapter 18, verses 60 through 64 now. Since we're a little more unfamiliar with these texts, I'll actually read these we'll read these now. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. You can actually leave that one up a little bit longer. So, with Josephus here, I want to kind of get this out of the way. There's some tampering that happened with this text. I don't want to blow that out of proportion, but you're going to see that if people know of this or they learn of this, and they'll want to throw it all out. I've highlighted the areas where scholars believe there was tampering done in red. Most likely, people think that a Christian had access to the manuscripts well after it was probably written, but then he basically doctored out the text to make it look more favorable to Jesus. Scholars, though, even if those areas, we throw out those areas in red, scholars still believe that Josephus said three things clearly in this passage. They look at the other vocabulary and they make a variety of judgments based on that are well evidenced. So Josephus says at minimum that Jesus was a popular rabbi of Jews and Gentiles, and that he performed wonderful works. Likely, these events that we believe obviously were miracles. At minimum, Josephus thinks that his followers thought they were miracles. Number two, he was crucified by Pilate at the request of Jewish leaders. Number three, the church was still around when Josephus wrote in the 90s. So some scholars also believe that Josephus even originally wrote that the disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them. That would be excellent enemy attestation if it were true. But even if, again, we throw out everything in red, Josephus is still a strong example of enemy attestation of Jesus' death by crucifixion. We also know, again, that he was known as a rabbi who performed astonishing deeds, likely things that, at minimum, to Josephus' opinion, appeared miraculous, and that the church was still alive and strong 60 years after Jesus had died. And that's significant because, again, remember, Josephus was a Pharisee in Jerusalem in the 50s and 60s. He would have been privy to church activity there to know what was being preached. All right, so our next passage in Antiquities is in chapter 20. I'll read this one as well. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. You can leave that one up as well for a second. So does the name Festus sound familiar to anyone? Anybody who's read Acts recently, maybe? So Festus was the same Festus that was actually in Acts, I believe it's 25. He's involved in the trial of Paul before he goes to Caesar and Caesarea. But just for context, it's kind of tangential, but so that you don't feel overwhelmed by this passage. Ananus was the high priest, and Festus was the governor that had just died. Albinus was going to replace him. Ananus is not supposed to execute anybody without the Roman governor's permission, but he kind of takes advantage of the fact that Albinus is not there, and he has James, the brother of Jesus, illegally executed. So getting into what actually matters for our purposes, though, Josephus uses a term here that's really important when he talks about James' execution. He says that they were brought or accused to be breakers of the law. That's important because it strongly supports the idea that James died for his faith in Jesus as Messiah. The Sanhedrin, they charged him for breaking the Old Testament law, the breakers of the law, the Old Testament law, because they thought Jesus was a false prophet. So the death by stoning also is really good evidence for James' death because this was the prescribed punishment for blasphemy. So we have this breakers of the law term. This is the prescribed punishment for blasphemy, to be stoned according to Leviticus 24:14. So two really good pieces of evidence that James didn't just die because he was a criminal. He died because he was preaching that Jesus was the Messiah. So with the second passage in Antiquities, Josephus provides us with enemy attestation of James, the brother of Jesus' death by martyrdom. And that's only around, by the way, 30 years after it took place. Josephus writes this in 93, 94. James dies in the early 60s. That's very close to James' death. It's also significant because we have, again, enemy and early attestation together of James' death by martyrdom. And because Paul, again, reports to us in 1 Corinthians 15:7, whether it's in the Creed or not, Paul at minimum reports that James saw Jesus, or that Jesus appeared to James. And so James's faith is not just, faith in Jesus like you or I would have, but he has faith in Jesus as an eyewitness. Blaise Pascal said, "I believe witnesses who get their throats cut." And people, psychology tells us, don't die for things they know to be false. James would know whether or not, at least if Jesus appeared to him. All right, so again, Tacitus, which we talked about previously a little bit. Again, he writes the Annals in 161-17. He's thought of as the greatest Roman historian. He provides us with a clear example of enemy attestation of Jesus' death by crucifixion, and again, like Paige mentioned, persecution of the early church. All right, it's a long passage, so stick with me here. I just think it's very interesting, and let's get into it. To get rid of the report that he ordered the burning of Rome, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, then upon their information an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Sorry, I know that's a little graphic, but it's very valuable as a historical source. And it's valuable because Tacitus mentions three things in particular in this passage. Number one, Jesus suffered the most extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate, probably from what we know about how that term was used, probably referring to crucifixion, most likely. Two, what he calls the superstition likely is referring to the belief of Jesus in Messiah by his followers. And he writes that superstition was briefly stopped or briefly checked before it broke out again in Judea and then spread to Rome. So Tacitus doesn't go so far as to say that Jesus' followers believed that he appeared to him, but he does say there was some sort of break in time. Doesn't get into details of how long, but some sort of break in time between when Jesus' followers said he was Messiah, he died, and then when they started believing he was Messiah again. So Jesus' resurrection would be a very plausible way to explain that chain of events. Number three, the Roman Emperor Nero had an awful, brutal campaign of persecution against Christians and blamed them for a fire that had broken out in Rome. It's a really good historical source here that we have in Tacitus because, number one, he's very hostile towards Christians. You can clearly read that. Multiple references where he clearly does not like Christians, speaks very antagonistically towards them. He calls Judea the source of the evil, and he refers to Christianity and Christians as criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment. Clearly, he had no interest in making up anything positive about them. But at the same time, even as he's critical of Christians, this is clearly not a work of Roman propaganda, because Tacitus is extremely critical of Nero, former Emperor Nero. He says that Nero, or identifying rather, that it was to glut one man, Nero's cruelty, that Christians were being tortured and executed. So finally, in summary here, Tacitus is a really significant source because, like Josephus, he provides enemy attestation of Jesus' death by crucifixion, writes that the belief in Jesus as Messiah only temporarily was stopped before it broke out again after his death, and he reports again that Christians experienced extreme persecution under Nero. The details also that he provides of early church history are consistent with what we hear from other sources, like our next one. So does the name Clement sound familiar to anyone? I kind of gave it away. Actually, I didn't. I'm sorry. It's in my notes, not in your notes. So we haven't gotten here quite yet, but we'll get here in Philippians. A Clement is mentioned in Philippians 4:3 that Paul knows. Scholars unsure, maybe the same one. But this Clement, we know for sure, was a bishop in Rome, lived from about 35 to 100, wrote this letter to the church in Corinth in 90s. Obviously, you guys know 1 Clement's not in the Bible. This is non-canonical, but it's still valuable as a historical source. In chapter 5 and 6 of his letter to the church in Corinth, Clement strongly supports the martyrdoms of Paul and Peter. Scholars debate over the term he uses, about what exactly he means by them, but at minimum, even skeptical scholars will admit that that term means that they extremely suffered. Probably means they died, most likely. But very interestingly, if you guys remember, we just read about how Nero had an awful persecution campaign against Christians. And Page mentioned that Paul and Peter's martyrdoms in the early 60s fall within that time frame when Nero is emperor. So their deaths as well have additional strength just from the historical context that Nero was persecuting Christians and having them executed. Also, we only again have a gap of 30 years between when Peter and Paul died, most likely died, and when First Clement wrote about it. So that's only 30 years. That's really no time from a historian's perspective in terms of assigning early attestation. And as well, First Clement, in terms of its reliability, we know from other sources that Clement probably knew the Apostle Peter personally, so his connection to the apostles as well strengthens the reliability of the source. Furthermore, again, just like James, I would arguably even more so, Peter and Paul, very clear eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus. Paul himself, we have his own words saying this, and Peter through indirect testimony. People just don't die for what they know to be false. So if Paul and Peter were martyred, which the evidence shows that they were, then we have to look at the fact that they're sincere. They claim to say that Jesus appeared to them, and they died proclaiming that still. That's really strong evidence. A quick aside, by the way, many of you probably have heard that all 11 apostles except John were believed to have died by martyrdom. Church tradition tells us that for the remaining apostles. There's some possibly good evidence from a historical perspective for Andrew and Peter. The others, I think they probably did, especially because that seems to be what Jesus suggests in the Gospels. We just don't have good historical evidence. I don't want that to alarm anybody. We have really good evidence, again, for these three, possibly two more. And then we have extensive evidence that the disciples were willing to suffer for their beliefs. You look at Acts, you look at Paul's epistles, it's really clear. The disciples suffered over and over and over and over again proclaiming the same message. All right, so we're going to break down these creeds a little more. We talked about them a lot. I know it's probably going to be sick of hearing about these creeds at the end of the night, but I want you guys to remember these because they are so important as historical sources. So remember, these were summary statements used in worship. Pastor Mac talked about it actually. The creed in Philippians is a really good example of this. They were used in the early church, often sung in worship, and they were memorized. And they contained just summary statements that were really important beliefs. They are extremely significant historically, again, because they're composed very early. 1 Corinthians, probably within 5 years, the resurrection, maybe even 3. And they're most likely composed as well by the Jerusalem leaders. They're coming directly from the people who knew Jesus best, who witnessed him alive after his resurrection. And there's good reason, again, like I said, to think that the creed in 1 Corinthians was composed extremely early. And it's definitely the strongest of these three that we have here, these creeds that Page also went through earlier, because it goes through it covers the death, it covers Jesus' burial, it covers his resurrection, and it mentions the appearances. Not just one, but it mentions 6, like we said earlier, 6 appearances to people, some of which are in group settings, some of which are individually one-on-one. Don't want to break it down too much, but just so you know, if you encounter somebody very skeptic, we have both what's called internal and external evidence that these are creeds, especially the one in 1 Corinthians. Internal evidence, as it kind of suggests, refers to evidence that we have within the text. So scholars note again the presence of these characteristics that show that this was originally composed in Aramaic, and also that there was kind of Jewish expressions in the text. So that's viewed as internal evidence, suggesting that, again, it came from the leadership in Jerusalem. We also have external evidence as well, though. In the 1 Corinthians Creed, right before the Creed, Paul says, "For I passed on to you, the Corinthians, what I also received." That received is really important. On its own, it would imply that, of course, he didn't get this from himself. He didn't make this up. He got this from somebody else. The received as well, scholars note, that's a rabbinic term. So this is claiming that Paul got this from a trusted source that he viewed as a rabbi, as a teacher. And we know, again, from Galatians 1 and 2, that Paul spent 15 days with Peter. They were not just doing small talk like this entire 15 days. I'm sure they were just comparing the appearances of Jesus in those experiences and just talking about doctrine. Paul had already been, at this point, been a Christian for 3 years. He had been preaching, and scholars think, at least many non-skeptical scholars, and even I think skeptical scholars have to grant that he probably got these creeds from Peter or from James, the brother of Jesus, who he also saw during that initial trip to Jerusalem 3 years after he became Christian, 6 years after the resurrection. So again, these signs all point to the fact that this was an authentic creed that Paul got from the apostles in Jerusalem. And I just put it up there one more time. We're not going to read it just for time's sake, but I just want to challenge you guys again to work on memorizing this one next, once you've got Philippians 2, 6 through 11 down. All right, so our next historical source is none other than Paul. Now, Paul provides us, like we said, with the best historical material for investigating the resurrection. Again, he claims to be an eyewitness. He claims to have seen the risen Jesus. That would in itself provide early attestation of Jesus' appearance to Paul, because he's writing that only 20 or so years after that experience happened. And his experience, remember, changed him, as you guys know, from being violent and persecuting and hostile towards Christianity to being one of its staunchest defenders. That's not enemy attestation. I don't want to get those terms confused, because Paul writes this as a Christian. He's not writing these letters while he's not a Christian, but it's close. You know, he's writing as somebody who admits what he used to believe in, as somebody that was not a Christian, and that should at least incline us to listen more closely to his testimony, because he's not the kind of person that would have been predisposed to have wishful thinking and want Jesus to have been risen from the dead, to have an imagined or hallucinated experience. That wouldn't make sense, because he was clearly an enemy of Jesus when Jesus appeared to him. So most Christians, including all of us, I believe, we believe that Paul wrote all 13 letters that are attributed to him by church tradition that are in the New Testament. Some scholars that are critical do debate the authorship of 6 of the letters. So that's Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and then Titus. But the 7 that are up here that you guys see, virtually all New Testament scholars will say that Paul wrote these. There's no debate. And thankfully for us, maybe you already noticed, we talked mostly about 1 Corinthians and Galatians. Those are not on the table for debate. Scholars will grant that Paul wrote those, scholars of all stripes. And thankfully, again, as you've already seen, they're dripping with material for us to work with. All right, so we're going to briefly kind of go through these verses, because we're more familiar with these, you know, since these are in our Bibles. I'm going to kind of summarize the key points in each of these passages. We're going to start off with Galatians 1, 13 through 19. So in this passage, we again have that criterion of embarrassment we've been talking about over and over again. Paul admits, and he's a Christian writing here, obviously. Paul admits, though, about his former way of life in Judaism, how he's persecuting the church, and that he was zealous for the traditions of his ancestors. But then he goes through how God called him through Jesus, obviously through the revelation of Jesus and the experience that he had in seeing Jesus, to knowing Jesus and to preaching the gospel. And he then relates how, kind of the timeline of events, how he went to Arabia for 3 years, came back to Damascus, and then how he went up to Jerusalem, like I was telling you, we were talking about. He gets to know Peter, stays with him for 15 days, and he also sees James, the Lord's brother. And then in Galatians 2, 1 through 2, and then verses 9, we see here that 14 years after his conversion, Paul went to Jerusalem a second time. And remember, in the end of chapter 1, Paul spent the last 11 years in Syria and Cilicia preaching and teaching. After this, though, he returns to Jerusalem, and he sees James, Peter, and John, who he identifies in verse 9, as you see, as the pillars of the church, he wants to verify that he's actually preaching what is correct. He's been preaching for 11 years. That's a long time. And he wants to actually make sure, did I get the gospel right? So when he meets with the group, number one, they acknowledge that God did, in fact, call Paul, a former enemy, to preach the gospel. And they gave him the right hand of the fellowship, to him and Barnabas. So in doing that, it appears the apostles are not only just accepting him, but they're also endorsing him. They're confirming the gospel message. We have no evidence that they corrected what he was preaching, and that they endorsed him to go out to continue to preach among the Gentiles. So that supports the fact that Paul and the others, they were in close contact with one another. They were verifying their teaching, and they were keen on preaching a unified and true message. They weren't just out there preaching whatever sounded right to them at the time. And again, Paul is verifying this information with what he respects as the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, the original apostles. All right, finally, our last kind of important verse that we're going to go over in Galatians 3:13. I'll just read this one because it's short, and once it comes up here, that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree." And as you see, that's a direct quote, that bolded section from Deuteronomy 21:23. So this verse is significant a little more for theological reasons rather than historical ones. So while Paul states what we know to be the wonderful reality of the atonement, that Jesus took our curse that we deserved, the curse of our sin, onto himself on the cross, at the same time, while that's true, from a historian's perspective, the fact that Jesus was hung on a tree, cross tree, see the similarities there obviously, seemed to say to the Jews that he was a criminal deserving of death. If you look at the context in Deuteronomy 21, 22, 23 below, if anyone is found guilty of an offense deserving the death penalty and is executed, and you hang his body on a tree, you are not to leave his corpse on the tree overnight, but are to bury him that day. For anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So at face value to the Jewish observer, and I mean, we have their quotes, I think, even preserved in Scripture as well, Jesus appears to be cursed by God in this context, because that's linking him with a criminal's death here. So crucifixion being a very public and humiliating way to die, Paul doesn't just admit that. That would be embarrassing on its own right, but he connects the dots. He basically makes this claim that, again, theologically, we know that this is beautiful and this is awesome, but Christ, in a sense, was cursed. Jesus was cursed by God by being hung on a tree. So Jews and followers of Jesus, they would not have made up Jesus' crucifixion, considering that it was such a stumbling block for Jewish culture and for Jews to believe in a crucified Messiah for so many reasons, that being one of them. And then we next have our key verses in 1 Corinthians, starting with 1 Corinthians 1:22 through 23. For the Jews ask for signs, and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Kind of picking up where we left off here, Paul again identifies that a crucified Messiah is a stumbling block to the Jewish belief in Jesus, and that they ask for signs. We know the resurrection is the sign of signs from God, that Jesus is the Messiah, but the crucifixion, it's still hard for the Jewish observer to get past. It's just such a stumbling block. And Paul is up front with that. He's not trying to hide that. Paul also calls this foolishness, that the cross is foolishness to the Gentiles. So we have the criterion of embarrassment for both Jewish and Greek audiences here. And there's no reason, again, for Paul or for the early church to make up Jesus' crucifixion unless it was actually true, because it was so difficult for their culture to believe that this happening to somebody, this person still could be the Messiah. If they were going to make up a story in order to spread their message, try to cause some social and political upheaval, why not make a message then that was easier to accept and believe? And then later on in 1 Corinthians 9:1, we read, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" So this verse is important because you will sometimes encounter skeptics who kind of say, well, you know, you look at the details of Paul's experience, I think it was just a vision. I think he just, had some sort of weird vision thing, and that was that. And it's true. If you compare Paul's experience of seeing the risen Jesus with the other narrated experiences in the Gospels, then it's true there are differences. Paul's blinded by light, and here's kind of, Jesus' voice speaking to him. He can't see for 3 days until Ananias heals him. But I think a lot of these can be explained by the fact that, remember, Jesus is appearing to Paul 3 years after he was initially raised, so it's a post-ascension appearance. I think Jesus is has a different nature to him. Obviously, like we said, he has a glorified body, but him being exalted in heaven and ascending to heaven, I think explains why it's different in terms of how they look different between the two accounts. But Paul doesn't leave any room for ambiguity for the skeptic to say it was just a vision. Paul just saw this. He just hallucinated or whatever happened. Because he believes, whether or not skeptics want to say this happened or not, Paul believes he saw Jesus in the flesh. He clearly says this in Jesus our Lord. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And you will find as you read Paul that Paul defines an apostle as somebody who has seen the risen Jesus, calling himself an apostle here. And later on in 1 Corinthians 15, he lists his appearance right after all of those appearances in the Creed. And from what we know about other sections of Scripture, those appearances were clearly physical encounters with a risen bodily Jesus. And Paul does not say that his experience was different, and he does not make his appearance look less than these other appearances. He's putting it kind of on the same par with these other appearances that we know were bodily encounters. All right, so quick review of the Gospels and Acts as historical sources. Remember, like Paige mentioned earlier, the Synoptic Gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Historians often view the core material in these three Gospels as being one source because, from a historian's perspective, it appears that they think that Luke and Matthew used Mark as their primary source in writing the document. Synoptic, by the way, just means see together. So it's just that these Gospels have the same perspective because there's so much overlap of material. They have the same perspective in terms of what they focus on in Jesus' life and ministry. Again, like Paige mentioned, most New Testament scholars believe in what is called Markan priority, Mark being written first, Matthew and Luke in some order after that being written afterwards. They think, again, scholars will argue that you see sometimes verbatim usage of Matthew and Luke, and from a historical perspective, that was not what you did unless you were directly quoting. So that the fact that you have verbatim material in a large portion of the Gospel suggests that they were directly using Mark. At any rate, we have a historical core that Mark, Matthew, Luke report on. We do sometimes have independent details. Matthew will provide us with independent details. Matthew and Luke together will provide details that are independent of Mark, or Luke provides us with independent details. So on case-by-case basis, we sometimes have multiple sources, even from within the synoptics. We do, again, have in John, though, a source that all scholars will believe is independent. Again, it seems that John knew about the synoptics, but the material he provides is largely independent. He obviously agrees in the most important events in Jesus' life, his crucifixion, the resurrection, feeding the 5,000 is also in John as well as the synoptics. The fact that Jesus performed miracles, his self-understanding of himself as Messiah. But Mark and John as well provide, like scholars have noted, like Paige mentioned, they're really respected by scholars in terms of being candidates for eyewitness testimony. We obviously believe the Gospels are all eyewitness testimony, but Mark and John really are respected for how they show eyewitness testimony. We also, again, have another independent source in Luke with the writing of Acts. Like we mentioned earlier, Luke provides really good historical material to work with through these sermons that he records. Peter's sermon in Acts 2 at Pentecost is a really good example. And the scholars believe that these sermons were really kind of summary statements of what the early church preaching in Jerusalem was like. And it kind of encapsulates the early church preaching. So just to kind of summarize, because there was so much information I threw at you, thank you for listening. Have kind of this brief summary to go over these again one more time. We have two really good, there were other non-Christian sources, but two really good non-Christian sources in Josephus and Tacitus. Both likely report that Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Josephus may even report that Jesus' followers believed that he appeared to them after his death. And then Tacitus as well reports that the disciples' belief in Jesus as Messiah, that it stopped briefly when he died, but then it popped up again in Judea before spreading to Rome. We also have a good non-canonical Christian source in 1 Clement. There are many others. Many of you are familiar with the church fathers. So 1 Clement's a really early church father. We also have Polycarp, Ignatius. Their writings are important, but for the sake of time, 1 Clement gives us really good early attestation for Peter and Paul's likely death by martyrdom. And it also, that fact, again, remember, that supports the fact that Peter and Paul were sincere in proclaiming that they saw Jesus after he had risen from the dead. They were willingly suffered and died proclaiming that message. To some extent, that also fits the criterion of embarrassment because Peter and Paul, again, died proclaiming a message that was viewed as a stumbling block and foolishness to Jewish and Gentile cultures, that Jesus was crucified and yet still was Messiah and the risen Lord. And for our main sources on the resurrection, all of which appear in the Bible, we have at least 5 independent sources. Again, remember that Dr. William Lane Craig, who Paige referenced earlier, said that ancient historians think that they've hit pay dirt when they have 2 independent sources, and we have 5, and they all, again, report within 1 generation after the events took place. These include, these 5, number 1, the early church creeds. They are our earliest historical source in the resurrection. Again, they were composed orally. They were meant to be memorized and sung for worship. They likely have an origin dating to within 3 years after Jesus' death, and they come directly from the apostles in Jerusalem. Again, they're our best source of contextual credibility. Remember that criteria that shows that the text in Greek was translated from Aramaic, from an oral Aramaic creed, which again supports the fact that they came from the Jerusalem apostles who spoke Aramaic. So our next source being, again, our Pauline epistles, the letters that Paul wrote. We got early eyewitness attestation from a former enemy who claims to have verified his teaching with Jesus' disciples in Jerusalem. Paul's admission to formally persecuting the church, to a historian, that fulfills the criteria for embarrassment as well. Third, we have our synoptic gospels. Again, that's Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Again, usually compressed into one source historically for most of the events they report on, because Matthew and Luke appear to use Mark as their primary source. And we have early attestation in all these Gospels, especially Mark, since he's written only 35 years after Jesus' death. And we also see the criteria of embarrassment. Those examples we gave over earlier. Peter's denial of Jesus, the woman as witnesses the first of the empty tomb. And we have the dissimilarity. We have elements in the Gospels like Jesus being referring to himself as the Son of Man, the sign, King of the Jews. Things that are not in the rest of the New Testament are in these Gospels that are important to establish reliability. Remember, again, John's independent as a historical source according to historians. He does agree with the most important details of Jesus' life, but largely has material that's independent, that's different from the synoptics. Both John and Mark score high marks, according to historians, in being eyewitness testimony. Lastly, again, Luke, we just talked about this one, so really quickly, Luke provides us with really good material in Acts through these sermons that he records. He also, by the way, in Luke, like Paige mentioned earlier, he's thought of by many to be a really good historian. When you test him compared to other ancient historical sources, where he can be tested, he kind of passes. He's shown that he's reporting true information. He also sometimes reports embarrassing information. So the fact that there's this Jerusalem council, there's a debate over whether or not Gentiles should be circumcised. The early church, through Luke, is not kind of brushing under the rug their disputes, their disagreements. He even records, just on a kind of daily life note, Paul and Barnabas have kind of a spat before Paul heads off for a missionary journey. They get so angry they don't go together. So he's willingly reporting information that's, at minimum, it's kind of like, you're admitting that you're flawed information about yourselves. All right. feel like I've been talking too fast. We're probably feeling a little tired, but we're arriving at the crux of our seminar. So if you need to grab, I guess it's decaf coffee, but if you need to grab something to get energy for these last 30 minutes, I just want you to be laser focused, because this is really, this is where kind of the rubber hits the road, and we get to the really good stuff that you can take to people that are doubting the historicity of the resurrection. We're going to tackle the historical facts. We talked about the sources that historians use to establish the facts. We're actually going to get to the facts and what facts scholars agree, whether they be Christian, skeptical, somewhere in the middle. What happened to Jesus? What do scholars agree to have happened? So in this section, we're going to talk about what we call, or what is called, the minimal facts approach. This is developed by Dr. Gary Habermas. We haven't name dropped him yet, but he is the world's leading expert on the resurrection. He's actually down at Liberty. He's professor emeritus, I believe, at Liberty. So after years of study, Dr. Habermas personally was still experiencing doubts, some of those being about the resurrection. And, you know, I'm not a scholar, but from what I've read and from what he has shared as well, scholars really debate over and over again all the minutiae, all the little details of the biblical accounts, Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, the Greek that it's recorded in, all this stuff. It can be really easy for scholars like Dr. Habermas to get bogged down in the details, to become very kind of cynical, detached, and hypercritical. So in addressing these doubts, he decided, I'm going to take a look at facts that even the most skeptical scholars in this field will grant to be true. And I'm going to see if these facts what they'll lead me to believe the best explanation of these facts is. So I'm going to test these facts. Can Jesus' resurrection hold up to only using the minimal facts that all scholars agree to be true? And those key facts, we're going to call them, for the purpose of our seminar tonight, historical bedrock. That comes from Dr. Mike Licona. I just like the definition a lot. I think bedrock gets the idea across that facts, these are facts that are regarded by virtually all historians as indisputable. Dr. Licona and Dr. Habermas, by the way, they're experts in the resurrection. They collaborated in multiple occasions in terms of studying the resurrection. And our favorite way, finally, before we actually talk about the facts, to describe the minimal facts approach comes from Dr. Habermas himself, who's a very engaging speaker. He's described this as the heads I win, tails you lose argument. That's kind of quick and witty, and it sums up just how much this argument strengthens the case for the resurrection. And we're confident that the resurrection theory is not only compelling, but it's also the only tenable historical hypothesis that actually explains the historical bedrock, the facts of the fate of Jesus. All right, so our core historical bedrock include these 3 tier A facts. And remember, these are accepted to be true by virtually all historians of Jesus, whatever their worldview is. Number 1, like we mentioned a million times tonight, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, Jesus' disciples sincerely believed they had individual experiences of seeing the risen Jesus. And number 3, Paul believed that he had an experience of seeing the risen Jesus. Now, our next set of historical facts, we're going to call these tier B bedrock. I think they're worth including. It's worth noting these are only agreed upon by a strong majority of scholars. In some cases, that includes skeptical scholars and non-Christian scholars, but it doesn't enjoy the nearly unanimous consensus that the previous tier A facts we just read have. These are, number 1, Jesus' disciples sincerely believed they had group experiences of seeing the risen Jesus. 2, James, the brother of Jesus, believed that he had an experience of seeing the risen Jesus. And 3, Jesus' tomb was empty. We are going to give these a little less weight as tier B facts because again, they don't enjoy the nearly unanimous consensus. They're still worth using in our investigation, but we're going to weigh them a little less heavily than our tier A facts. All right, so going through these, tier A fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Obviously, Jesus cannot have risen from the dead if he didn't die. So establishing the fact that he did die is important. John Dominic Crossan, he is a very famous historian and scholar of Jesus. He is very skeptical. He's a member of the Jesus Seminar. If anybody's heard of the Jesus Seminar? And yet, even though he does not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that he's the Messiah, or that really a lot of the events in the Gospels that are reported to have happened, that they actually happened, he says that Jesus' death by crucifixion is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Strong words, but don't take my word for it or his word for it. Let's actually look at the evidence. So using our criteria of our historical authenticity, which again is on that cheat sheet, we have 5 out of 6 criteria that are met here for the death by crucifixion. Number 1, multiple sources report on it. We have at least 6 independent sources that report on Jesus' crucifixion. All of our main sources that I've gone over with you tonight. And then as well, we have enemy sources in Josephus and Tacitus who report that Jesus died by crucifixion. We also have all of these sources reporting, even the enemy sources report early. Josephus reports that only 60 years after it happened. And we also have the fulfillment, again, of, like I mentioned, early attestation, the early sources as well reporting even before that. We also have the criterion of embarrassment fulfilled because, like we've gone over, the idea of a crucified Messiah was a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles. Paul even goes so far as to connect it to that verse in Deuteronomy where it says that somebody who's hung on a tree is cursed by God. So it is on the face value, or on the face, it's an embarrassing thing that they're admitting to from for a historian's perspective. We also have the criterion of dissimilarity. Remember the cross that Pilate hung, which said King of the Jews. That title, again, is not used elsewhere in the New Testament for Jesus. Historians think that gives it more historicity. It was more likely to have actually been placed there because that's associated with the crucifixion and with the account, gives more weight to it being historical. Let's also not gloss over the extremely high plausibility that if Jesus was crucified, he died. He did not survive crucifixion. It's been said that the Romans did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. It is a gruesome, slow, but surefire method of execution, and soldiers would even give what they called death blows to ensure people on the cross were actually dead before they were taken off. We actually, by the way, have, some of you may know, we have report that Jesus received a death blow. John mentions in John 19:34 that Jesus' side was pierced with a spear. Usually, people on the cross, their legs were broken because you have to push up on the cross in order to breathe. But they found when they sent men to Jesus that he was already dead, and they pierced his side to confirm that, though. We also know of only one recorded survivor crucifixion. Josephus mentions in his book, his autobiography, that he had 3 friends who were being crucified. He goes to the Roman commander and he asks that they be taken down. All 3 are taken down. All 3 are given the best medical care that Rome can offer. 2 of them die anyways. 1 does recover, but again, they're taken down while they're still alive. Finally, we have from the Journal of American Medical Association, they published an article in 1986 and basically concluded that the death of Jesus, from using the historical evidence, that it is consistent with modern medical interpretation. Jesus likely died of what they called hypovolemic shock or exhaustion asphyxia. So again, we have 5 out of 6 criteria met here. If a historical event even meets 1 criteria, then it's viewed to be as very strong evidence that it happened. We have 5 out of the 6 here.
Brady, which of the 6 was not met?
The contextual credibility, so that's the one, again, where we have like the Aramaic, Jewish, that influence shown in the Greek text. We have 1 Corinthians 15 creeds say that Jesus died. We don't have by crucifixion. So, there's some evidence there that he died. It's just not clear in that creed that it's by crucifixion. Good question. All right, TRA fact number 2. Jesus' disciples sincerely believe that he appeared to each of them after his death in one-on-one encounters. So I wanted to make really clear, there's kind of nuance here that more skeptical scholars will grant that Jesus appeared to his disciples individually in one-on-one encounters. We have some of these recorded in Scripture. Obviously in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, we have that Jesus appeared to Peter. That's an individual appearance. We also have in John 20 that Jesus appeared one-on-one to Mary Magdalene. And then we later have Jesus appearing to James, appears to be an individual appearance, and then to Paul. Paul's traveling companions in Acts, you may remember, they do hear the voice that Jesus spoke, but they don't see Jesus. We also have some skeptics will grant that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, it does include the 12. So it says Jesus appeared to the 12, meaning the 12 apostles. Some skeptics will take that and they'll say, well, I think Jesus appeared to the 12 individually. They don't believe that was in a group setting. We have other sources, our gospel sources, saying that those were in group settings. Either way, even if, whatever, that's a large number of people to account for that Jesus appeared to. 12 people is a lot. Again, these appearances of Jesus enjoy multiple and early attestation. They're reported by all of the main biblical sources that we went over earlier, and by 2 out of the 3 early church creeds we went over in particular. And the fact that, again, the individual appearances of Jesus, they appear in these church creeds means, again, we have that criterion of contextual credibility met because we have direct Aramaic creeds translated into Greek that are coming to us in the New Testament. Finally, again, we have the criterion of embarrassment. Remember, to the first century Palestinian and Greek audience, they viewed the testimony of women as being inferior to that of men. And we have an appearance in John's gospel of Jesus to Mary Magdalene. So if John's making this up in order to convince his audience that this appearance actually happened, for a historian's perspective, he would not have made it up, that Jesus actually appeared to Mary. Even, by the way, the most skeptical scholars, even they will grant that they believe that Peter and Mary Magdalene both believed they saw Jesus alive after he died. So all of the 3 Tier A facts we went over are very important. They're all important, but I'd like to think of this third fact here as kind of our ace in the hole. We'll see this later. So we have multiple and early attestation that Jesus appeared to Paul. That comes from his letters and then also from Luke in Acts. Paul reports this within around 20 years after the resurrection, so that's very early. Luke's a little later, but it's still considered early attestation. We also, again, see the criterion of embarrassment. Like I mentioned previously, Paul is not shy about hiding who he used to be and how he used to persecute the church. Furthermore, we have that evidence that Paul was endorsed and accepted. His teaching was confirmed as he was sent out by the Jerusalem apostles. He received the creeds from them as well, we believe. And if you think about Paul's former life and worldview as a Pharisaic Jew, we contend that it's essentially inconceivable that Paul would have, one, be predisposed to hallucinate and to imagine that Jesus appeared to him. Doesn't make any sense. Or that he would have any motive to lie. What would he have to gain? All right, moving on to our Tier B facts. Tier B fact number 1, Jesus' disciples sincerely believe that he appeared to them after his death in group settings, not just individual, but group settings where 2 or more people were present. Dr. Mike Licona, by the way, estimates about 75 to 85% of all New Testament scholars grant this fact to be true. This Tier B fact, just to distinguish between the one-on-one encounters we mentioned previously and the group encounters, this includes the appearance to the 500 brothers and sisters that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians. We also have, probably the more famous one is the appearance of Jesus to Thomas. He appeared to the 12, there were 11, or 10 actually rather, present at the time. They still retained the name 12 even after Judas had died. But he appeared to the 10 and appeared a second time when Thomas was there, because Thomas said, I don't believe it, not until I put my finger and my hands into his sides and into the nail holes. And technically, if you're being really skeptical, only the appearance to the 500 in the creed is explicitly stated that he appeared to them at one time. So while all 500 were present, we contend that it's very, 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 very likely, the way that the 12 reads and these group appearances read, that these were all group experiences. And even in, again, the Gospels, like the encounter that John mentions, John clearly is reporting this information as if all the disciples were together when Jesus appeared to them. So we have multiple attestations of these group appearances. I mentioned John, but we also have group appearances in the synoptics in Matthew and Luke. And again, I believe it's implied, like we said earlier in Mark, that we have good reason to think that Mark was reported a group experience as well. And again, in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, we have additional attestation that Jesus appeared to the disciples in group settings. Again, we have the criterion of embarrassment met here. Matthew reports that Jesus appeared to the two Marys. So just like the appearance to Mary Magdalene, Jesus appearing to women. Again, the sexist and patriarchal culture of the time thinks that would have been embarrassing. And we have the disciples admitting to have doubted when they saw Jesus in Matthew's recounting of the group appearance of Jesus to the disciples. And moving on here, we have tier B fact number 2. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, sincerely believed that Jesus appeared to him after his death. So we have early attestation of this event. Paul records this in the 1 Corinthians 15 passage. We said earlier there's some debate about whether that original creed included the appearance to James or if that was material that Paul added to the creed. That's why I had the check minus here. I still think it probably was in the original creed, and many scholars contend that. But just so we're being very honest and transparent, check minus for that as far as it being in the creed or not. But regardless, it's very early attested. Paul reports it only 20 years after the resurrection. What arguably, though, is more compelling about this fact of the appearance to James and his conversion is, again, the fact that James was not a believer in Jesus during his earthly ministry. Even though he was his half-brother, would have witnessed who he was in early years, could confirm for his sinfulness, by the way, as well, could vouch for that. Even with all that, seeing all the miracles he performed, knowing of his earthly ministry, even though he wasn't a follower, he was not a believer until it appears that Jesus appeared to him, and that all changed. Why would the early church, again, make up James being a non-believer unless it was actually true? And I'm not going to read these next verses just for time's sake, but these, in case you want to look these up for more detail and you have in your packet, these are the references that kind of prove to us pretty explicitly that James was not a believer in Jesus during the time of his earthly ministry. All right, so for our third and final tier B fact, we have the empty tomb. The empty tomb has really good evidence behind it, even though it's not accepted by all scholars. It has multiple and early attestation from the Synoptic Gospels, John and Acts, 3 sources. We also have implied early attestation in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. In that creed, where it says Jesus died, he was buried, he was raised, and he appeared, we don't have that his tomb was empty, but it's arguably implied. If he died, was buried, and was raised, you can kind of see that the empty tomb is kind of hidden in that, I would think. And also, I think it has the strongest fulfillment of the criterion of embarrassment. We talked about it really early on when we first mentioned the idea of the criterion of embarrassment, that again, for the sexist, patriarchal audience, the testimony of women was inferior. So for the disciples, the authors of the Gospels, to have put the women as the first witnesses of the empty tomb definitely fulfills this criterion. They would not have made it up unless it were actually true, that the women were actually the first witnesses. We know this, by the way, in terms of the testimony not being respected by women from several sources. Josephus actually reports on this as well. Finally, we find that the empty tomb is plausible given our historical knowledge. Page mentioned early on the early Jewish argument or rebuttal for the resurrection, that Jesus' disciples just stole the body. So what we don't have is we don't have other rebuttals about what happened to the body, other than the fact that it was stolen. And if the body was stolen, then it admits the tomb was empty. So it's really good evidence from an enemy source that the tomb was actually empty. Otherwise, they would have been able to say something else besides they stole his body. All right, so that's the historical data, all 6 facts. Take those first 3 as kind of our most important, and we have our tier B facts below that Christian and skeptic alike agree upon. But now that we have these different data points, what is actually the best explanation of how they all fit together? Again, the minimal facts approach that we are putting forth, it suggests or it makes clear that the resurrection makes the best sense of these bedrock facts. But let's first establish one more set of criteria using historical method, which is the criteria for the best explanation. And again, distinguish for a moment historical hypotheses from scientific ones. Page kind of really did a great way of distinguishing scientific knowledge from historical knowledge. Historians cannot directly access the past. They can't go back in a time machine to see what actually happened. They are looking for what they call the residue of the past. And with the facts that they gathered, that residue that we just went over, they're going to use these criteria to make and evaluate hypotheses as to what they think actually happened. So if it's a helpful analogy, if not, drop it, but if it's a helpful analogy, imagine that you are trying to put a puzzle together. You have a jigsaw puzzle, you want to put the puzzle together. All of the facts that you have in your historical investigation are like individual puzzle pieces. And you're taking those puzzle pieces and you're trying to put those together and make a puzzle, a clear picture of what you think happened. So hypotheses, again, are these attempts to put the pieces together. They compete with one another to try to argue which one is the clearest illustration of data, which one makes the most sense. Whatever puzzle formation, whatever puzzle comes out on top, makes the most sense, makes the clearest picture of the past, should be the one that is regarded as what probably happened and what is provisionally held as historical unless other data comes out to challenge that hypothesis. So starting with our first criterion, we have plausibility. Now, this is a really fairly commonly used word. We use plausible, and I think, myself included, we use it sometimes to mean probable. That's kind of part true, but at least for historians, plausible more accurately means the extent to which a hypothesis is consistent with background knowledge. For example, it's highly plausible that when Jesus spoke to Jewish audiences during his ministry, he spoke in Aramaic. That was Jesus' native language. It was the native language of the people he was speaking to. It's natural. If you and I are going to speak, we're probably going to speak in English. It's our native language. And so it's very plausible. It makes sense that he would have done that. It's a red flag, by the way, if a theory has really low plausibility. Because if it has low plausibility, then it really has to have other good evidence to kind of overcome that bad starting point if it's not consistent with what we know in our background knowledge. Next up, explanatory scope. So going back to our jigsaw puzzle analogy, explanatory scope is, did you use all of the puzzle pieces in the box? Did you use and try to explain all of the known historical facts surrounding the investigation in the picture or the hypothesis you came up with? So a hypothesis would earn a top score in explanatory scope if it used all of the pieces, if it accounted for all of the facts. If it ignores some, it gets a lower score. Next, we have explanatory power. Explanatory scope is a question of quantity. Explanatory power is a question of quality. How well does the hypothesis use these facts? So going back to our puzzle piece analogy, our puzzle analogy, imagine you have a puzzle piece and you think it fits in this one area, but you try every angle and it kind of seems to fit, but then when you have it all together, you're like, oh, that's upside down here. That doesn't make sense. In the same way, a hypothesis with really low explanatory power kind of strains and contorts facts to make its theory work. And when you get to the end, it just is shown that it was so forced. But an explanatory power does the best job of limiting its strain, making the puzzle pieces fit together the most naturally to make a clear picture. Finally, in terms of our main criteria, we have what is called less ad hoc. Ad hoc is a Latin term. It means for this. Basically, it refers to historians' usage of kind of speculation or kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of made up hypothetical scenarios in the hypothesis. So we want to have less of this, hence the parentheses there. We want to have as little unevidenced speculation as possible in our hypothesis. We want to rely on the evidence as much as we can in order to make our claims. Quick example, I'll give you a spoiler alert. One of the theories we're going to tackle in just a few minutes here is called the evil twin theory. So the theory goes that Jesus had an identical twin brother who was born from Jesus and maybe separated at birth, maybe a couple years later. Either way, he's out of the picture at the time of Jesus' ministry, but he reappears in the scene right at the exact time, right after Jesus died, shows up to the disciples and says, I've risen from the dead. So this is the poster child, as you have followed so far. This is the poster child for ad hoc. We have no evidence, absolutely none, that Jesus had an identical twin brother. There are so many loops and jumps this theory has to make in order to, make a theory at all or to make a hypothesis. So this is a really good example of ad hoc. We do not want anything like that in our hypotheses. Finally, this is kind of a bonus criterion, but it's worth mentioning. Illumination is the degree to which a hypothesis offers answers to other relevant questions or be groundbreaking and changing our knowledge in a particular field. It's put best in an illustration. So, for example, a lot of New Testament scholars debate on what Jesus or who Jesus thought he was, Jesus' understanding of his self-identity. And if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that would illuminate that debate. It would provide really good answers that he was, in fact, the divine Son of God that he actually claimed to be. So it would shed light on things that are kind of in question or thought to be correct but would be proven otherwise, if true. All right, so we've kind of equipped ourselves with our criteria. We're going to use these as we're going through these different theories. We're here at our first hypothesis, which is called the conspiracy theory, which is kind of a take on the old, again, Jewish earliest rebuttal that Jesus' disciples stole the body. So you can think of it that way. This series says that the disciples stole the body, and then they lied. They just said that he rose from the dead instead. So this theory does address, as you see in the check marks and X's here, it does address 2 out of the 3 tier A facts, and then 2 out of the 3 tier B facts for 4 out of 6 total. There's no real clear attempt to account for the appearance to Paul and to James, so it does not get any credit there. So besides ignoring multiple facts like we just saw, this theory performs really poorly when you actually look at it and break it down with its criteria. First, it's highly implausible. Paul and James, they're not even accounted for in the theory, but even if they were, they would have no reason to go along with this conspiracy because Paul is a Pharisee and James doesn't believe in his brother when Jesus was alive. They would have put themselves personally at risk. Why would they do that? Secondly, again, we established earlier, people do not die for what they know to be true. Psychology tells us this. So if we have good evidence to think that some of the disciples were martyred for their faith and all of them were willing to suffer for their faith, and they would have known, again, whether or not it was actually true, why would they lie proclaiming what they knew to be false? Also, we have knowledge of failed messianic movements from kind of after and before the time of Jesus. In all of those movements, after the claimed Messiah, the false Messiah, was executed, the followers either went back to what they were doing before they started following him, or they followed somebody else who said they were the Messiah. We don't have any other evidence of another movement where the followers said that this person rose again from the dead. So background knowledge-wise, we would expect that Jesus actually died, didn't rise from the dead. His followers would have done the same thing. Furthermore, again, remember, the crucifixion was a humiliating death. It was a stumbling block. Paul's identified it as Jesus being cursed. They wouldn't make up that death either as part of their narrative to try to conceive or deceive people. Also, in terms of explanatory power, this theory falls short. People, again, they typically conspire for something they can gain, material, wealth, whatever it is, or power. We don't have any evidence that the disciples financially benefited or gained politically from their role in the early church. Paul is not an original disciple, but he does say in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 that he was a tent maker in order to not be a burden on the Thessalonians. The original disciples, while they were leaders in the early church, to what end? They didn't rival Jerusalem or Jewish leadership or the Romans, and they were persecuted by both. We have no authority. We have no evidence that they lorded their authority over the disciples or over the early church either. Also, in terms of less ad hoc, there's not a lot of speculation in this theory. I think because it's really simple. They just say Jesus' disciples stole the body. They don't have to do a lot of twisting and turning like with the evil twin theory. But there is an ad hoc component because there's no evidence they stole the body. That's just a hearsay claim from enemies. Finally, for illumination, if the conspiracy theory were true, it wouldn't really do a whole lot. I mean, it would just prove that Jesus' disciples stole the body and Jesus wasn't the Messiah, but it wouldn't change the way we think about religious movements or anything else. Number 2, we have our swoon theory, or the apparent death theory. So as the name implies, Paige went over this one earlier, way back at 6 o'clock. This theory claims that Jesus only appeared to die. He swooned on the cross. He actually regained consciousness while he was in the tomb and then emerged. It performs even worse than the conspiracy theory. It only accounts for 2 out of 3, or 1 out of 3 of the tier A facts, and then 1 or 2 out of 3 of the tier B facts. It's very implausible. We already talked about how if people were crucified, they died. It's that simple. We only know of 1 exception from Josephus, and again, remember, he was taken off the cross while he was still alive and given medical attention. And 2 of his friends, they died anyways, giving the same treatment. And the swoon theory really performs very poorly in explanatory power, because imagine for a moment, Jesus, again, somehow, after he's been flogged, he's bleeding, he has awful wounds, he pushes up every time on the cross in order to gain, a moment to breathe. He scrapes his back on the with nails and the wood, and he's bleeding. He passes out, and he keeps breathing, which isn't actually possible naturally with the way crucifixion works. But anyways, let's just assume that's true. He then later comes to in the tomb, 3 days later, hasn't eaten or drank anything, and he pushes the huge heavy stone by himself, probably can't be pushed away but from the inside, walks past the guards somehow, and then he walks a couple miles to the disciples where they're staying and says, "I've risen from the dead." If that actually happened, I mean, Jesus' disciples probably would have rushed to go get a doctor, first and foremost. It doesn't sound like the kind of encounter that's described with the risen, glorious Lord. I heard one pastor say this would be like the zombie Jesus as opposed to like the glorified Jesus that we actually see recorded in the Gospels. The swoon theory also has a few ad hoc components. Again, there's no evidence that Jesus was taken down from the cross. That's just an assumption. And some, again, Muslim scholars really hold to this theory. They, again, believe that God simply made Jesus survive crucifixion. That's obviously theoretically possible. We can imagine that being possible, but there's no evidence for it. And it goes against our background knowledge of crucifixion and our historical knowledge. This does perform well in illumination, I will say that. I mean, Jesus would be the second survivor of crucifixion ever in recorded history, and the first without medical attention. So that's something. We have kind of like a combination for our third theory here, which is the displaced eaten body wrong tomb theory. We're running short on time, so this theory kind of assumes that the women went to either the wrong tomb, Jesus' body was moved, or he wasn't buried to begin with. We have really good evidence that Jesus was buried, which we've discussed a little bit previously. We also have good evidence that Jewish burial practices meant that bodies were buried permanently, not temporarily, so the body wasn't likely to be moved. Jews who would have moved a body would have been unclean for 7 days, according to Old Testament law. This theory just seems very implausible as well, and it doesn't account for a lot of the main facts. You have to combine it with other hypotheses to be true. Moving here very quickly, I'm sorry we're rushing. We do have, thankfully, all these recorded in our packets, and if anybody wants the speaking notes from tonight, you can also email me for those. Our next theory, though, again, is the evil twin theory. We already discussed that one. I would just say you can see how it doesn't account for many known facts. We already know it's ridiculous, very speculative, and it does not do a good job of explaining the evidence that we do have. I will spend just a couple minutes, if you guys can hold with me a little bit longer. The hallucination theory, number 5, is the most respected theory among critical scholars. It does do a much better job of accounting for most of our known facts, only leaving out the empty tomb. And what we will say, though, is when you actually break down the hallucination theory with the criteria that we've been talking about, it actually really falls upon analysis. Hallucinations are much rarer than people that are proposing this theory think they are. only about 15% of people in their lifetimes will experience hallucination, according to the American Psychological Association. About half of those are grieving senior adults, none of which the disciples were. They were grieving, but not senior adults. And only 7% of all hallucinations are visual hallucinations. It's much, much, much rarer to have a hallucination as well where you have two modes of experience, be they seeing, hearing, eating, smelling, whatever. The disciples reported like all three modes in one encounter with Jesus. So it does not match up with what we have in the historical evidence, not match up as well that the odds of all these people having hallucinations are very, very low. We mentioned there are so many people to account for. Doesn't make sense. Also, the psychology does not believe that a group hallucination is possible. Just as group dreams are not possible, group hallucinations, according to psychology and what we know about the mind, they are not possible. So it cannot account for our tier B fact of the group experiences of seeing Jesus. And furthermore, we also know, again, that while it's somewhat plausible that maybe Peter had a grief experience that predisposed him to hallucinating Jesus, at the same time, he also could have been very jaded. He could have looked at Jesus' crucifixion like the other Jews did and said, oh, well, Jesus obviously was a failed prophet. It must have been wrong. And he could have dealt with his guilt a different way. So it's not 100% to say that Peter would have had a grief hallucination and the other apostles would have as well. So again, the hallucination theory also is very ad hoc. It kind of does a lot of psychoanalysis, assumes certain things about Peter and Paul and the different characters, and creates different situations in their lives that would make them be more predisposed to experience a hallucination. But psychologists will tell you it's very hard to psychoanalyze somebody who's right in front of you, let alone somebody who lived 2,000 years ago in a completely different culture. Psychoanalysis really is not welcome in historical analysis unless it has really good evidence to do so. Finally, resurrection theory. We'll end here. I wish we had more time for our table talk, but you guys will clearly see, as you know already before you walked in here tonight, the resurrection theory is the best explanation of the data. It accounts for all of the facts that we've worked hard to establish. Jesus rose bodily from the dead, and we also have really good meeting of all of our criteria of the best explanation as well. Regarding plausibility, like Paige kind of mentioned earlier, the resurrection is neither really implausible or plausible because God is in the picture. In terms of miracles, God is a free agent. So probabilities only deal with what we can explain naturally. Probability theory doesn't work with God's activity because he's kind of above all of these attempts to explain what we think probably happens in a given scenario according to statistics and stuff like that. But it's certainly more plausible than everything else because we show that every other theory is implausible. It doesn't make sense. And in terms of explanatory scope, power, less ad hoc elimination, clean sweep, we have it meeting all the data that we have gone through tonight. It explains it with very little strain. And I would like to talk more about how it does all of that. Please talk to me. Obviously, we love talking too long about all this material, so I'd love to talk more with you about this. But I do want to just do one final, as we skip our table discussion, quick just application, make it clear to you guys that if Jesus rose from the dead, one thing you can assure yourself of already, be more convicted of, is that Christianity is true game, set, match. I want you to challenge as well, lovingly, skeptics who you come into contact with, to really look into this evidence and to help them through it. And that if Jesus did rise from the dead, it is the foundation of our faith. And if Jesus rose from the dead, then we can be sure of many other things here. One of which is that Jesus is who he said he was. God vindicated Jesus and his words by raising him from the dead. He would not have raised somebody who was lying about themselves. So Jesus claimed to be the divine Son of God, the Messiah, to offer salvation to all of us is true. And finally, ending with verse 30 and 31 from Acts 17, we see that it also confirms that the gospel is true. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent because he has set a day when he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed. He's provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So God is saying through the resurrection of Jesus that there is one gospel and that message is true and to be believed by all of us for salvation. So thank you so much. I hope you all learned something tonight and you have grown in your knowledge. For anybody that wants to stay, I will be here to answer any questions. I'm sorry we can't do that more together. Thank you for staying 8 minutes late with us.